Okay, well, believe it or not, we have finally finished the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, not the sermon itself, just the introduction, which only took like 3 or 4 months. So, but I mean, there were a lot of breaks in between there, right? So not quite that long. But now that we finished with the Beatitudes, which describe the character of a disciple, Jesus now transitions into a discussion on how a disciple of his is supposed to live. And so what we see here is that the focus of the Sermon on the Mount first is on our character, and then it's on how we live. But before we begin a discussion on what our lifestyle is supposed to look like as a disciple of Jesus, let's not forget how this whole sermon got started. Okay, remember the first words Jesus spoke in this sermon in verse 23 were what? Blessed are the poor in spirit. In other words, blessed are those who are spiritually bankrupt, who know that they're sinners and who know that they have absolutely no ability within themselves to live according to God's law and who therefore recognize their need for a Savior. Cannot emphasize enough the importance of how this sermon gets started. It doesn't start with a list of do's and don'ts. It doesn't start with a checklist of rules that we need to follow in order to become a disciple of Jesus and a citizen of his kingdom. It starts with a description of what a member of God's kingdom actually looks like. And that description begins not with perfection, but with humility and a surrendering of ourselves to the King, which then results in all of these blessings, the greatest of which is being in the presence of the King himself. As we saw last week, these building blocks of blessing that we see in the first part of this sermon, they begin and they end with the same blessing. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? And what is the kingdom of heaven? Well, it's where the King lives. It's the place where his presence is and where his will is done perfectly. You know the prayer, right? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And how is God's will done in heaven? Perfectly, right? Instantly, every single time, without conflict and without compromise. Now, is that how God's will is done in the earth? Well, obviously not. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't be teaching us to pray for that to happen in this prayer. No, God's will is not done in the earth the same way that it's done in heaven because his kingdom does not encompass the whole earth yet. But a day is coming when it will, and what an incredible day that will be. But in the meantime, Jesus is calling his disciples to live as kingdom citizens on an earth that is not yet surrendered to the will of the King. And so what does that look like? Well, that's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. See, anyone who tells you that your faith is a private matter that doesn't involve the world around you doesn't understand what faith is. None of us who follow Jesus follow him in isolation. In fact, the context of the Sermon on the Mount, the setting of this sermon is the perfect picture of that. Remember what was happening at the time this teaching took place? Jesus, up until this point, has been teaching in the local synagogues, but now the crowds have gotten so big, he can't fit there anymore. And so Jesus has to shift gears a little bit. And so in chapter 5 and verse 1, it says that Jesus, after seeing the crowds, went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And then he opened his mouth and taught who? Them. Who's them? His disciples, right? But then skip down to the end of the sermon, chapter 7 and verse 28, and look what it says there. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. And so here's the setting of the Sermon on the Mount. The King, Jesus, is teaching the citizens of his kingdom, those who are his disciples. He's teaching them what life in his kingdom is like, while those who are not his disciples are listening in and being affected by what's taking place right in front of them. And in this case, they were astonished at Jesus' teaching. Not only that, verse 29 says they were astonished by his authority as well. For he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So they were affected by Jesus' teaching. They were affected by his authority. And they were affected by how different he was. By the fact that he was so unlike all of the other teachers that they were used to listening to. And so as Jesus is teaching his disciples what it looks like to live as a citizen of his kingdom here on earth, he is also illustrating it for them as he's teaching it. And what he's illustrating is simply this: your faith is not private. People are listening in. Your life of faith is meant to affect them. And here's how he describes that effect in verse 13. You, meaning the disciples, right? Because Jesus is directing this teaching to his disciples, not to the crowd. He's teaching them. And so this is meant to be an emphatic you. In other words, you and you alone are the salt of the earth. Now, what does that mean? Salt has a lot of different uses. But in order for us to understand what Jesus is talking about as far as us being the salt of the earth, we have to first look at how salt was primarily used in the first century. And although it was sometimes used as a seasoning like we use it today, it was primarily used as a preservative. It prevented meat from going bad. And so whether it's fish or some other form of meat, salt would keep the meat from spoiling by preventing the growth of bacteria and other microorganisms, and that's the extent of my knowledge of biology. The point is, because they didn't have refrigeration, because they couldn't keep the meat cold, it would quickly spoil and decay if it wasn't quickly treated with salt. And so when Jesus says to his disciples, you and only you are the salt of the earth, what is Jesus saying about the earth? See, the idea here isn't that Christians are called to, travel the earth like Salt Bay and season the planet or something like that. Although there is an element to that a little bit, which we'll get to a little later, not Salt Bay, but the seasoning part. But the idea here is very different. The focus here is that the earth is in a natural state of decay. And that apart from you and others like you, who are followers of Jesus, it will continue to decay. In other words, decay is in the natural state of the earth. Not evolution, but devolution. Things don't naturally get better, they naturally get worse unless they're treated. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of technological advances over the last several hundred years or so that have added to our quality of life. But do you know where many of those advances came from? A lot of them came from the church, from believers, from other followers of Jesus. Believers like Isaac Newton, arguably the most influential scientist of all time. A man who may not have gone to the moon, but his understanding of physics is what helped us get there. Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, also a Christian, who was quite literally the salt of the earth. His understanding of bacteria and germs absolutely revolutionized the medical field and the way that we treat diseases today. And he was a believer. In fact, his son-in-law wrote this about him in his biography. Absolute faith in God and in eternity, and a conviction that the power for good given to us in this world will be continued beyond it, were feelings which pervaded his whole life. The virtues of the gospel had been ever present to him. That's Louis Pasteur. And then there's George Washington Carver. I mean, here's a guy who was convinced that his faith in Jesus is what enabled him to make the many discoveries that he made over the course of his life, which included, by the way, 118 different uses for a sweet potato. Now, I don't mean recipes, I mean like glue and rubber and vinegar and things like that, and 300 different uses Ford? Anybody guess? A peanut, that's right. 300 different uses for a peanut, not the least of which, of course, is peanut butter. And so, of course, there have been advances in our quality of life over the past several hundred years, right? A lot of which came from people who were followers of Jesus. But spiritually speaking, there is still a very obvious decline and decay that is happening in the world, which is more obvious now, I think, than probably at any other time in history, simply because of the fact that today most people aren't surprised by it anymore. People are no longer surprised by the moral decline that we see all around us, or by the decline of the stability in the world, or the decay in our institutions, the decay in our families, in our government, things that maybe we believed in or trusted in 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, we don't trust anymore because we see the decay. We see it happening right in front of our eyes. And so part of what Jesus is saying when he calls you as one of his disciples to be the salt of the earth is he's saying the earth needs you, and that apart from you, it will simply decay. But, as verse 13 goes on to say, but if salt has lost its taste, and that phrase, lost its taste, is taken from the Greek word moraino, which is where we get the term moron from, which means foolish or stupid. And so, if salt has become stupid, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And so the point that Jesus is making is very simple. Salt is salt. Okay? It can't stop being salt. That would be stupid. And in the same way, it would be foolish for you to not be who you are, to not live like the salt of the earth that you are, because that's who you are. See, Jesus doesn't say here that we're to become the salt of the earth. What does he say? Yeah, we are the salt of the earth. So be who you are. Stop trying to blend in. Stop trying to hide the fact that you're different. Be different. Remember, that's how Jesus was. What does the crowd say about him again at the end of the sermon? He's not like any of the teachers we've ever heard. He's different. Christians are meant to be different. We're not supposed to be like everyone else. We're supposed to be different. See, some people think that the more Christians look like the world, the more receptive the world will be to following Jesus. When in reality, all we're really doing is trying to avoid persecution. Let's not forget how the Beatitudes end, right? Blessed are those who are what? Persecuted. Verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Not for being a jerk, right? You're not blessed for being obnoxious. You're blessed for being righteous, for not participating in that conversation in that way, for choosing not to engage in that kind of behavior when everybody else is. And in doing so, you're being salt. You're inhibiting the decay. You're seasoning the conversation. And you're causing change. You're being an influence simply by being there and by being different, which creates the opportunity then to be light. See, where salt may be a more passive kind of influence, where you're not really doing anything more than just being who you are in Christ and being true to that, being a light is a more active kind of influence. But it's also who you are as a follower of Jesus. Look at verse 14. You are the light of the world. Now again, just like salt, Jesus isn't telling us what we can become. He's telling us what we are. This isn't something that you strive to become. This is something that you are. You are the light of the world. That's what Jesus is saying to his disciples, and not just to some of them, but to all of them, to you and to me. You know, I wonder if we really get that. Right? You, Ian, are the light of the world. You, Donna, are the light of the world. You are. If you are a believer in Jesus, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you have been born again, then you are the light of the world. That's what Jesus tells us. Now, I know it seems too good to be true, but Jesus says it's true, and do you know why he knows it's true? Because he's the light of the world, right? The same Jesus who says you are the light of the world also said what? I am the light of the world. Here it is in John chapter 8. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. And whoever what? Follows me. How many followers of Jesus do we have here this morning? Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will what? Will possess the light of life. And so even when Jesus makes this announcement that he is the light of the world, immediately after that, he very quickly says, and if you follow me, you will have that light as well. But he doesn't stop there. Because he who is the light not only gives us light, but he makes us light as well. The Apostle Paul understood this. In Ephesians chapter 5, he writes these words to the church in Ephesus. For at one time you were in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. So as followers of Jesus, we have received the light, we have been made the light, and now we have become transmitters of that light. You are the light of the world. Now, in what way do we as disciples of Jesus provide light to the world? I think there's a few answers to that question. One thing that light does is it exposes the darkness. Have you ever sat in a room toward the end of the day? Maybe you're having a conversation with someone, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in the room and flips on the light. You're like, whoa, I didn't even realize it got that dark in here. That's what light does. It exposes the darkness and the things that belong to the darkness. That was the effect that Jesus oftentimes had on people that he was around. We mentioned last week how he had that effect on the Pharisees who thought they were so spiritual and so holy, and then Jesus shows up, and now all of a sudden people can see how they're really pious and proud. And so light exposes the darkness and things that belong to the darkness, but not only that, light can show us the way out of the darkness as well. See, if you're trapped in a dark room and you can't see the way out, a light can help you find the way. A light can help you find where the door is or where the light switch is. It can show you what's causing the darkness and how to get out of the darkness, which is really helpful when you're in the dark. But see, when it comes to spiritual darkness, that's not the biggest problem. There's an even bigger problem than not being able to see the way out. And in John chapter 3, we find out what that problem is. John 3:19 says this, "The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed." And so the light exposes the darkness. It shows people the way out of the darkness. But if that's all the light does, then in the end, it's not enough. Because as long as people love the darkness, they won't come to the light. And that's why the gospel is such good news. Because the gospel solves the whole problem, not just part of the problem. And that's why you and you alone are the light of the world. Because as a follower of Jesus, here is what you have to offer people. First of all, you're able to show them the way out of the darkness, and that way is a person, and that person's name is Jesus, the light of the world who came into the world to seek and to save the lost. Jesus came from heaven to earth and made a way for us to be reconciled to God. He took upon himself our sin, which is the root cause of that darkness that separates us from God. And in its place, he gave us the light of life. On that cross, Jesus exchanged our sin for his righteousness, our darkness for his light. And with that light comes not just a new understanding of who God is and who we are because of him, but new desires and new appetites. Those have been given to us as well, where we're finally capable now of actually loving the light and hating the darkness, instead of loving the darkness and hating the light. A fundamental transformation from the inside out. That's the good news that you have to share with people, and that is why you are the light of the world. Because you're not just sharing religion with people, you're sharing the light of life, the Spirit of God, the Spirit that lives in you. And that Spirit, that is a light that cannot be hidden. As Jesus goes on to say in verse 14, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. See, it's not that it can be hidden, but shouldn't be. It can't be hidden. It's not possible. Like salt that's not salty, that's moronic, that's stupid. Could you imagine trying to hide an entire city, right? Especially a city on a hill. You can't hide that, but that's the whole point. The light of life that has been given to you, the Spirit of God that is in you, that's not something that can be hidden. It's too big, it's too prominent. It literally changes the landscape. And that's what the Holy Spirit is like in us. He changes us dramatically. And that change should be noticeable. I mean, how can it not be? He saved us from our sin. He gives us a new heart. He makes us a new creation. And he puts his Spirit in us. That's going to leave a mark. How can it not? And so the question isn't whether or not the light of God's Spirit is bright enough and powerful enough to make a difference in people's lives. There's no question that it is. The only question is, how willing are we to let that light shine? Because we'd be crazy not to, right? And that's basically what Jesus is saying at the end of this passage. Look at verse 15. Do people light a lamp and put it under a basket? Oh, they put it on a stand. Duh. And it gives light to all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And so again, what Jesus is doing here is he's driving his point home with another absurd illustration. Can salt not be salty? And even if it could, what good would it be then? Be useless. Can you hide a city? How about a city on a hill? Give that a shot. Oh, and when you get your lamp out at night and you fill it with oil and you trim the wick and then you light the lamp, do you just shove it under a basket so that nobody can see it? No. Of course not. What do? I put it on a stand. Yes, you put it on a stand, of course. And you know why you put it on a stand? Because that's what you do with a lamp. That's the obvious thing to do. So why don't we? Because, I mean, that's why Jesus is giving us all of these absurd illustrations, right? His point is not that it's not possible to keep our faith hidden from people. His point is, why would we? That's absurd. That's moronic. That's foolish. Why would you put your light under a basket instead of putting it on a stand? You know, there's an answer to that question. Sin makes you stupid. Now, I don't know who the first person was that came up with that line, but because it's not very eloquent, but it is very true. The only reason why people who have been given so much would be reluctant to share that with others is sin. Now, maybe it's pride, maybe it's fear, but whatever it is, it's sin. It's putting ourselves before God. And we all do it, maybe in varying degrees, but we're all guilty of this. But see, here's the good news. Jesus isn't asking us to do anything complicated here. He's not telling us to make our light shine before others, but to what? Let it shine. Just stop trying to hide it. Stop trying to blend in and be like the world. Be salty instead. You know what I mean. Be that godly influence among your friends and your family and your coworkers. Let your light shine before others so that they can see your good works. And when they see how different you are and they ask you about it, tell them about Jesus. You don't have to shove it down their throats. Just be honest with your answer. And give glory to your Father who is in heaven, because that is the reason why we're here, right? It's not complicated. Just be the salt and be the light that you already are. Amen?